Now that we know how to work in 3D space, let's put our knowledge to the test and actually try and create a 3D model. As you can see here, I have the default Blender file opened up, and I don't want any of these objects to be part of my 3D model, so I'm going to get rid of them all by pressing A to deselect everything, and then A once again to select everything. Then I'll press X to delete, and we'll confirm that. There are tons of different 3D models that you can create in Blender using only primitive shapes. One of my favorite examples is a pine tree. The pine tree, although it seems like it might be complicated, is actually really simple to create. So let's go ahead and experiment. Let's start by breaking the pine tree up into two different parts: the trunk and the leaves, or I guess the pine needles. The trunk of the tree is basically a very long and tall cylinder. So in Blender, we'll be able to approximate the trunk of our pine tree by using a cylinder primitive. Then, if we look at the leaves of the pine needles, they seem to form a cone shape as they approach the top of the tree. So we can approximate these using a cone. This means that our beautiful pine tree 3D model can be created using nothing more than a tall cylinder and a tall cone. So let's get creating. We'll start by adding that cylinder, or the trunk that we talked about earlier. In order to do this, I'll just press Shift A to pull up the Add menu. Additionally, you can use the Create menu on the left, or you can press the Add button in the lower left of the 3D viewport. We'll come to the Mesh category and select Cylinder. Now we have a cylinder in our 3D scene. As we talked about earlier, this needs to be really tall. That way our pine tree has some height to it. So in order to make it taller, I'll press S and then Z to scale it along the Z axis. Now if I move my mouse out, we can make this significantly taller for our pine tree to work with. This looks like it's a pretty decent height, so now let's go ahead and add the other part of our tree, the pine needles. As we said earlier, these can be approximated using a cone, so I'll press Shift A, come to the Mesh category, and select Cone. As you can see, our cone is added at our 3D cursor. It's currently hidden inside of our other cylinders here, so in order to expose it, we can either move it out of this area, or in my case, since we aren't really going to need to move it, we can just scale it up to make it larger. And by doing so, we can see the cone is now outside. I guess at least most of it is outside of the cylinder, the tip's still inside. So I'll move it upwards, so it's near the top of our tree. And just like that, we have something that seems to resemble a pine tree. However, this seems to be just a little bit goofy. The pine needles seem very restricted up at the top, so we'll need to spread these out further downward. In order to do this, we'll just scale this cone across the Z-axis. So we'll press S, followed by Z to scale on the Z-axis. We'll make the cone a lot taller, and we'll move it down a little bit. Now you can see that our pine tree looks a little bit more like a pine tree. This is a pretty big landmark in your Blender learning experience. You just created your first 3D model. So obviously we should probably save this file, that way you can look back at it later. So in order to save a Blender file, we can come up to the File button in the upper left here, click that, and from the drop down we'll select Save. This opens up Blender's file exploring system, which is a little bit goofy looking at first, but the more you use it, the more you'll get used to it. There are a few system bookmarks that are available on the left, including your Documents folder and your desktop. You can also head to any sort of drive that you might have. For example, this is my C drive. I could go to Users, Grant, and I could save it anywhere in here. But in my case, I just want to save this file to my desktop. So I'll navigate to my desktop, and up in this top bar, we can give our file a name. Right now it's named Untitled.blend, but I want to name this My First Model.blend, just like that, and we'll click Save Blender File in the upper right. Now, if I exit out of Blender, either by coming up and clicking File, Quit, or choosing the X button, we can see that I now have a Blender file on my desktop called My First Model. And if we double click this, it will open back up, and just like that, we have our 3D model loaded back up. So, congratulations! You've just created and saved your first 3D model in Blender. I'd make sure you put this Blender file somewhere where it won't get deleted, because it's always fun to look back on old projects. Especially as a beginner, you'll come back and look at this project and think, wow, that took me that long to create. I could create that in seconds. And I mean, now you probably could. So go ahead and save that and keep it in a special location. Once you have that file moved to somewhere it won't get deleted, let's go ahead and create another 3D model.